There's a story in the Bible about a young man named Mephibosheth. Hard name to spell, hard name to say, but he has a powerful story. He was the grandson of King Saul, and when he was 5 years old, his grandfather, King Saul, and his father, Jonathan, were both killed in battle. And when the nurse found out about this, when she got the news, she grabbed little Mephibosheth, 5 years old, and started running. And as she's running, she fell and dropped the child, and he became crippled in both legs. And so, terrible, tragic story. He loses his father and grandfather and becomes crippled all in the same day. But fast forward years later, David is the king. And David finds out that King Saul has a grandson, Mephibosheth, who is still alive. And so he calls for him and asks him to come meet with him. Now, Mephibosheth is probably afraid because he knows how things work. You see, back in those days, if a king took over a new kingdom, he would typically have the children and the grandchildren of the previous king killed so as to make sure they don't try to come and regain the throne. So Mephibosheth is probably thinking to himself, I may be about to die. But what he didn't know is that his father Jonathan had entered into an agreement years before with David, knowing that David might become king. He wanted to make sure that his children and his grandchildren were safe. And so he entered into this agreement with David, asking him not to hurt his children or his grandchildren. And so all these years later, David remembers that promise. And so he calls Mephibosheth, and Mephibosheth bows before him in deep respect. And here's what King David said. This is in 2 Samuel 9, verse 7. He said, "Don't be afraid. I intend to show you kindness because of my promise to your father. I will give you all the property that once belonged to your grandfather Saul, and you will eat here with me at the king's table." Now, for him to be invited to eat at the king's table was not a one-time invitation. This wasn't a temporary honor. This was a permanent thing and actually included a pension from the king. So Mephibosheth is now set up for life. And here's his response. Verse 8, it says that he bowed respectfully and said, "Who is your servant that you should show such kindness to a dead dog like me?" Interesting that he refers to himself as a dead dog, because back in those days, dogs were not looked upon with excitement and with reverence, and they weren't lovable creatures like they are now. They were dirty scavengers, maybe how we would see a rat. I mean, people did not want anything to do with them. And so I don't know if this is how he saw himself, but the fact that he's crippled tells me that most likely he's struggling to provide for himself. And so he's either having to rely on someone else, or he's homeless, or he's a beggar. That's normally what happened. And so it could be that his self-image is really low and that he sees himself as nothing more than just some dirty scavenger. And so the fact that now David has shown him grace has changed his life. But the interesting thing here is that in verse 11 it says, "From that time on, Mephibosheth ate regularly at David's table like one of the king's own sons." So he goes from being an outcast who might be about to die, to now being royalty. Now there's one last thing that I want you to know. His name, Mephibosheth, means he who scatters shame. He who scatters shame. This was a guy who may have been living with a lot of shame. And so for him, David does exactly that. He scattered his shame by taking him from where he was to being royalty. And you know what? That's exactly what God has done for us. He's taken us from being scavengers, no good, people who were nothing better than dirty old dogs, to being royalty. He's taken our shame and He's shown us grace. And so whatever you're dealing with, maybe your self-image is not very positive. Maybe you're struggling with who you are or what God's calling you to do. Maybe you're living in a time of fear. Maybe you're living in a time of shame because of some things that you've done or things that have been done to you. I encourage you to let God take your story of shame and turn it into a story of grace.